All right, so welcome to another episode of Decisions Beyond Borders, mostly the same. I'm your host, David McCann. This is a show about behavioral science in various countries and cultures around the world, where we explore human behavior in organizations and in society at large. Today, I'm joined by Paul Espinas, the founder of UpUp Technologies. Paul and I first met maybe in the spring, I think, through a mutual friend here in Thailand. And we got to talking about employee engagement and HR tech, and that is how Paul and I first met. But today, I'd like to give Paul the opportunity to introduce himself, and I'm sure do a much better job of explaining his company than I ever could. So, Paul, can you first of all welcome to the show? But can you tell us a little bit about UpUp Technologies and yourself?
Sir, good morning, good afternoon, wherever our viewers are watching this show. Um, I started UpUp Technologies 2.5 years ago. I developed the company to really have a team who will focus on creating platforms that will improve employee experience of people at work, right? Before that, I was working for a job portal here in Vietnam called VietnamWorks.com. I was handling their marketing department for 5 years. We were juggling 8,000 seekers and 85,000 companies were actively looking for candidates within the platform. And I thought that there's a lot of innovations that's done within the recruitment front, but after people join companies, there's a really lack of first automation, and number two is platforms or systems that can help people have better experience with work. So that was my motivation on creating the platform. The first app we developed is called UpUp app. It's basically a performance management tool that rewards every milestone, recognizes every milestone of an employee. So if they achieve 10%, they unlock badges, or sometimes there are hidden rewards there and so on. And from there, we grew to different features and platforms to e-learning and HR analytics and so on.
So, a performance management system, I think, is probably a topic we could spend an entire hour exploring. But in interests of moving us towards a conversation around behavior, can you highlight maybe some of the interesting behaviors that this tool has shown you? I think what's probably most interesting for at least for me, I don't want to speak entirely for my audience, but you track behavior, specifically employee performance, under the guise of helping them have better experiences at work. So it would be really interesting to know, how has the pandemic around the world and in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia changed employee behavior?
Right. So for us, sir, we believe you're working with four different stakeholders within an organization. So you have your CEOs and business owners, you have your HR managers, you have your team leaders, and then you have your team members. Right. So each of these stakeholders, we believe they have their own priorities, they have their own pain points. So when we come in, the the company with our platforms, we're trying to address these pain points um, by making sure that one, the performance is on point for the employees, and number two, that they are engaged in the process. So when we created the platform, there are already existing employee engagement survey tools, right? So we do that. We measure employee engagement of employees. But the bigger question for us is what do we do with that data, right? So once we know a certain level of engagement of a team or an individual in the company, what's the action that we do with it? Okay? So this is where the features of the app comes in, wherein we track, for example, um, the level of engagement of an employee in correlation to their performance, um, and then in correlation to recognition, the number of badges they received, the rewards that they received within a given time frame. There are a couple of features that I can probably talk about that had a spike in terms of frequency of use when the pandemic happened. First is there's really an increase on newsfeed posts. So there's a lot of company-wide announcements being made within the platform, coming from HR and team leaders. So we've seen a massive spike on that one. We've also seen a spike on frequency on target updating. So before, because team leaders would set monthly targets, employees have the tendency to update it on a weekly basis, before the management meeting, probably, or the team meeting. But when the pandemic hit, we see every other day, every 3 days, there's an increase on number of targets updated within the platform. And then the last thing that we are heavily investing on this year was really on the massive consumption of the e-learning manuals and contents that we have within the app. So a lot of companies, they have a tab for their own SOPs, manuals, and online trainings. We've seen a massive increase on average time spent in the app. So before, 3 minutes was the average time spent in the app. Now it's 14 minutes. And it wasn't because they were playing with their targets. It was because they were actually trying to equip themselves with learning more about their jobs, capitalizing and utilizing the training modules that are already available within their e-learning tab. So what we did was, when we saw all this data, how can we actually add more value to our users, having seen that there's a massive interest on this parts of the app, right? So we started expanding on learning and development. So we created a series of webinars, and then we repurposed the contents into micro learning courses and provide it for free for all our users within the organization, within the app. So those are a couple of interesting changes that we've seen in terms of behavior of users within the app, and the actions that we made in response to that.
Well, like as I was hearing you talk about the L&D part and the webinars, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to speak on your show and witness what you're doing there, and I think that's a pretty exciting place to invest. But from a behavioral lens, what it sounds like is, in one way, people have overcome their needs to pay attention to something critical today, and we're seeing that in people saying, I'm going to invest for the future. In this case, the investment for the future is not necessarily money, it's time. Quite often, when we're in the world of work and in sort of a corporate or enterprise environment, maybe taking that half an hour or that 1 hour to take some elective course that's made available to us through our company, we just never have time to do. So it's very
Exactly.
interesting that you found opportunities, or you found data that's showing today employees are very much overcoming that always on the, how should we call it, the hamster wheel, and are getting off saying, you know what, I have a lot of busy work that I can do, but right now I feel it important that I learn something new to prepare myself for to be better able to do something. So
Yeah.
that's interesting. What what I find kind of interesting as a contrast, and maybe I'll get your thoughts on why they've done this, but the monthly goal setting with weekly completion by employees is, I think, a task that every salesperson, marketer, product manager, and every other kind of employee would know quite well. Why do you think that they've made goal setting much more short term?
Um, the length of the deadline was the same. The frequency of the employee updating their targets was more frequent. So we started actually asking some of our key accounts on why do they think that's the case. So the biggest correlation we've found to that, in terms of the answers given to us, was they actually heavily invested on rewards during this time. They had to let go with a lot of people. The people they kept, they're heavily investing on them. Although they had to let go of certain headcounts, the people they decided to stay within the organization or within the team, they increased the number of, say, vouchers or points that they can redeem within the platform.
So what you're saying then is effectively they gamified employee engagement.
Yes, sir. So because the way the performance management tracking works is there's a progress bar. Every 10-20% that the employee achieved, they unlock badges, right? So before, the reward is really just at the end of the month, on if you complete your targets and so on. Anything in between that was really just badges, virtual badges. Although recognition plays a role, we think that based on our discussion with our clients that the frequency of updating of targets was because they were adding now rewards within the badges with from 10 to 80%.
Well, it's a fairly, I don't want to say classic, but I think well thrashed out and executed toolkit that many, particularly social media companies, use. So I think about, for example, LinkedIn's progress bar encouraging you to
Yes.
complete your profile. Um, they're not rewards or recognition in the formal sense, in that there may not be, a cash equivalent prize given,
Right.
but it still has an appeal to the employee themselves. It's still a type of recognition, and it's recognition that my effort has reached a certain stage, and that
Right.
somebody is acknowledging that that has happened. That's a pretty brilliant and powerful tool that your clients are using. I hope that you take a little bit of you give yourself a little pat in the back for that particular tool.
Yeah. No, the story behind this, sir, was for 5 years I was managing a team of marketers for 30 marketers with Vietnamworks, the company that I worked for before. I was given a budget at the beginning of the year. So what I did was, this is our targets for the year. So I did this on an Excel file. I gamified the targets of my marketers, the number of traffic, etc. And then I distribute them the rewards based on the achievement on the target because I had full control on the budget. And then I just automated it with the UpUp, the platform that we created.
Powerful stuff, Paul. Real
Yeah.
powerful. So that's employee behavior, and I think you kind of alluded to what leaders are doing, but maybe we can shift the conversation a little bit, because how your product works and how you can make work a more engaging place could be the subject of today's entire call. But I want to know a little bit more about you and a little bit more about your business. So, as you approach new customers and say, I have this wonderful tool that can help your employees just have a better
Right.
work experience with all the benefits that that brings to you, the business. I want to understand a little bit more about what leaders are saying to you, either through your key accounts team or maybe even better through your sales and marketing efforts. What are leaders doing today that's different from what was happening last year this time, or even in the winter?
Yeah, so we started the company, sir, as I mentioned, 2.5 years ago. So I was speaking in, HR summits and all these things, and some people get it. Like there's a need for employee engagement programs, but we had a lot of no's. We had a lot of no's from very big companies for the reason like, why do we need a remote work management platform? Why do we need a platform that's here? Right.
Who
So
does
when
that?
the exactly. So when the our reasoning back then was, data shows that in 5-10 years people are going to be working remotely. This is what data is telling us. This is what the expectations of millennials and the younger generations in the workforce moving forward. So within 5-10 years frame, people are going to start working remotely. So when the pandemic happened, we didn't have to explain that part anymore. So that's, I think, the biggest change where we didn't have to validate the importance of having a remote work management platform like ours. We got a lot of callbacks from companies who didn't initially get it. Unfortunately, we also lost clients who are working in certain industries that are heavily hit by the pandemic, like your hotel chains, your F&B chains, and all that. But a lot of corporate clients that kind of like didn't get it and just told us we don't see the value of a remote work management platform started calling us back and really sat down with us on how to create a virtual work environment that doesn't only track performance but actually engages in an active participation, encourages an active participation of their employees while they work at home or where, from where they are outside the office. So that's the biggest change we had. I
The big one.
think, I'm sorry, sir.
It's a big one that they just
Yes, they got it finally.
to market.
Yeah, after 2 years. So that was the biggest change we've seen so far.
So
Yep.
this is a little bit off script, but you kind of
Yes,
touched
sir.
on it. What about virtual collaboration? Have you got any thoughts about that? Because let me tell you where I'm coming from before we dig into this. Um, it's much more difficult to work in creative industries or knowledge industries in particular from a distance. It's so much simpler to have a whiteboard and have a bunch of folks stand around it, maybe bump into each other and have a coffee and talk about it during these spontaneous moments. Um, it's difficult to collaborate remotely. Not impossible, but it's difficult because it's just different for us. And so I'm wondering, like within your world, have you got thoughts about how collaboration can be enhanced or improved, maybe with tech?
Um, for us, sir, internally, we've been working remotely for 2.5 years because that's our business, right? So we have offices here in Vietnam and Singapore and in Manila, but we don't really require people to go to office unless, of course, there's an important meeting or important client meeting that we all have to show up physically. But for our clients, in terms of collaboration, I really wanted to highlight the importance of understanding how communication works. A lot of them has not really a lack of it, but not fully understanding the value of medium used and the frequency of 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 sending certain information. For example, a company-wide announcement on uh, like changes in compensation and benefits can be posted once, but for teams who are directly involved with it, team leaders who are involved with it, maybe there's a need of a direct engagement, a call or a follow-up. I think there's a big need on on training office people in the workplace the importance of communication, what medium to use, and how frequent these types of information should be sent out, depending on who are involved in the team or who are involved in that project. I think understanding that will enable people to work together better virtually, because at the end of the day it's just really communication that's at the core of working together. So if there's anything that I invest on as a manager on what type of training should I or investment I should put on to make people work better virtually, I'd start with training them on how communication really works.
So let's put you on the spot one last time on this topic, if we could.
Yes,
Let's get a
sir.
little bit more specific. You guys
Yeah.
are fully virtual, and you've been that way from the beginning. And so you've managed to grow and have success without ever having to sit in an office together, or at least not force that. So let's call it product and marketing type problems. So you've had your business development teams come back with feedback. This is what customers are saying that they want, need, like, don't like. And that information comes back, and you sit your product and your marketing teams in some kind of virtual room, and you begin to hack through a solution. Can you talk about an early challenge or an existing challenge that you had to overcome? So you talk about communication in there, right? So that's the one that I've noticed many startups struggle with as they've moved
Yeah.
from having that conference room with the whiteboards to having to use tools like Mural or Figma. It hasn't worked quite the same way. So, what do you guys do?
We do is we have, for example, in your case, the business development manager comes back and say bank A, a potential client, gave me all these feedback. So what the the business development manager would do is do a share debriefing on the case for the client, what were the feedback are, and the people, the stakeholders involved in solving or creating a proposal for that client have doesn't have to respond immediately. It's a full Q&A session. Trying to understand the case for the client, what was the requirement, what was the pain point, and so on. And then there's a follow-up meeting the next day where the stakeholders who were in the first meeting will then share what they can do on their part. So, for example, on the product side, well, Bank A really doesn't have problem with communication because they already have a platform they're using for communication tools. Where their problem is coming from recognition, they need badge system, for example, and so on. So this is proposal of person A. Person B is on marketing and communication. Well, this client, although they have already platform they're using for communication, they don't have standard uh, how do you call this uh, design or setup for internal communications, like a weekly announcement, CEO message, for example. So then we put that together, and then we try to explain it if it's technical to the business development, so that the person can actually represent that proposal properly to the organization. So that's how we work. We don't really sit down and how to go bounce back ideas. If we are from different teams, we let teams with their own expertise work together, and then they come back to the business development head with a proposal that we can use for the client.
It to be completely honest, Paul, this sounds,
Yeah.
I don't want to call it business as usual, but I don't think any leader of a traditional business with office space would go, I don't think that what you've described is different. For argument's
Mm.
sake, like if I were to paraphrase it for enterprise language, your your business development manager comes back, keys some stuff into a CRM, maybe
Yes.
a Google Sheet in startup language, and that sheet or CRM is then shared with uh, maybe the project manager, maybe a customer success person, maybe a product manager, maybe a marketing manager, and they're all sharing and seeing this stuff. And then what happens is a bunch of debriefing happens on that day. The
Yes.
following day, there's a meeting that's set up where additional discussions are had. And maybe there is where some whiteboarding might happen. Somebody might have done a presentation, for example, on what they learned if they're
Yeah.
fancy. And then all the groups break off into their own component pieces and say, this is what we think, this is what we think, this is what we think. They come on back together. More debating happens again on maybe day 3 or day 4, whatever may be the case. And then they regroup for day 5 and say, this is what we're going to do. Is that
Yeah. Yeah. The key there for us is we do modular approach, meaning each team they already have predefined. For example, we work with so many features, right? For the app, it doesn't mean that we have to propose all of it. By understanding the business development head, it's easier for the product team to just pinpoint which features we think will be vital for this specific client. That makes the process way much faster for us.
And again, if I were to compare that to my first career, financial
Yeah,
services, you're not describing anything odd. I
yeah,
had a portfolio of product that was suitable for a variety of needs. A discussion was had with customer, and then a discussion was had internally, maybe more than once. And then we went back to customer and said, here's what we think will be what you need. And here's why we
yeah.
think you need it. And so back again, what you're describing is not rocket science. You're just
Mm.
saying, hey, listen, there are a different set of tools, and they can be just as effective as sitting in a room having a whiteboard conversation and being in an office. So, pretty great, Paul. Thanks for sharing that. I think that'll be encouraging to some folks out there. So, I think this has been an incredibly interesting interview. It's always great to talk to you, Paul. I love hearing about what work you're doing. If there were listeners that wanted to reach out and talk to you, how would you advise them do it? And if they wanted to talk more specifically about your business, where might we direct them?
I think the best way to reach us is really on Facebook. I know people have some privacy issues or with Facebook, but I think we've invested a lot of uh, manpower on handling inquiries we're getting from social media because we have over 200,000 followers on Facebook. So that's where we're very responsive. So
So
just go to
Facebook.
Move Up. All right. All right.
So move up.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll tag you in the post, and I'll put a link just in case to that site as well. So, Paul, thank you so much. This has been an outstanding moment for me to finally get you in front of the camera and ask you some questions about business. So, I wish you the best of luck, and thank you again for coming on and talking to me.
Thank you for having me too, sir.